when the lights were off, I was looking at all the glow sticks. Now I can't really see them, but you all were like, some of you, there was a few rebellion, people not wearing their glow sticks, But other than that, I could see all of you. It was kind of cool. Well, happy 4th of July. I'm glad. I know a number of you came early to, hang out with us. I thought that was really cool. With this week, with Governor Chris Christie throwing his hat in the ring for the presidential nominee, that makes 14 Republican candidates now, and there's 4 Democratic candidates. Now, if you were to go looking for a candidate, I mean, what would you look for? You generally, we look for people like, they've served in the Congress, maybe they were a governor, maybe they are in the party leadership, maybe they're a wealthy tycoon, or they worked in the cabinet or had a TV personality. Those are all the usual suspects, right? Not for God, though. For God, when he chose a king, when he chose somebody to rule a nation, he chose somebody who is a shepherd, an unknown shepherd boy in the middle of nowhere. Now, that's not normally where we go to look for somebody, right? But God, that's where he went. And that's where we're looking at the story of David. Acts 13:22 says, God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. See, God was looking for something different. He was looking for somebody who represented him, somebody who had his heart. Now, David was a Renaissance man. I mean, before the Renaissance. I mean, he was a warrior. He was an artist. He was a musician. He was a poet. He did all kinds of things. He just was this person of many, many talents. And so he's quite interesting, actually. We're going to look at his life, kind of over an overview of it. And I've broken it down into BK and that's not Burger King. That's before King and after King, okay? So BK, there's 3 major events before he became king. So open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 16, because I encourage you to follow along. Of course, it's in your outline, but if you have your Bibles, that's always good to be getting used to using your app or whatever you're doing there. Okay? Now, the 3 major events before he was king. The first would be his call. He got called out of where he was as this unknown shepherd boy into the limelight. Now, Moses led the people of Israel, across the Red Sea up to the Promised Land. Joshua led them into the Promised Land. Then for the next 300 years, you had the 12 tribes of Israel living in this loose confederation of tribes ruled by regional judges. The last of these judges was a prophet named Samuel. And the Israelites asked Samuel, they said, we don't want to be ruled by regional judges or prophets anymore. We want to be ruled by a king. So they asked him to select a king. And so Samuel chose, as God directed him, chose Saul. Saul seemed to have all the goods. He came on board, and yet there was problems with Saul that didn't work out. And so God ended up needing a new king. And so that's when Samuel was selected. 1 Samuel 16 there, beginning there on your outline, it says, the Lord said to Samuel, I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Now, Jesse had 8 sons. The first one Samuel met was Eliab, and he looked like he had the goods. He was tall. He was good looking. Samuel thought, this must be the guy. And so he prays, and God says, that's not him. So Samuel then sees the next son, and then all 7 sons go before him. Each one, he's thinking, well, this has got to be the one. And then at the end, God says, none of those are it. So he asks Jesse, he says, well, is that all? Do you have another son? He goes, yeah, I have one more. He's a shepherd boy. I didn't even invite him. I mean, that's what his own dad thought of him, that he didn't even make it to the party. This guy doesn't have a chance. So Samuel goes, I want to meet him. And so we'll wait. You bring him in. There in verse 7 it says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. He's talking about Eliab. He says that was his first son. He says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so none of these guys passed the mustard. He says, so he asked Jesse, are all these the sons you have? Is there still there is still the youngest? Jesse answered, he is tending the sheep. So Samuel says, go get him. And then it says there, he says, so he sent for him, and Adam brought in. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So God didn't pick the number one. He chose number 8, the runt of the litter, the one who wasn't even invited to the party. But why? Because God was looking at something different, right? That's what he said, is that, man looks at the outward things, God looks at the heart. And so that's what God was looking for. In fact, that's still what God looks for. When he's choosing to use somebody, he's looking for somebody who has a heart after serving him. Because there's some people that have huge talent, all of the skill, and yet God doesn't really use them a whole lot sometimes, because if their heart's not in the right place, if their heart's not inclined towards what God wants, then he'll just use somebody else. He'd rather use number 8 out in the shepherd's field than number 1 who doesn't have it. So that's the first thing, is the call. So he gets this call. He's anointed right there. He's king. But yet he goes out back as a shepherd, because it's Saul's not ready to give up being king. And so that leads us to the battle. This is another major event in David's life. It really kind of puts him in the limelight now. So not long after this encounter with Saul and David, the Philistines invade Israel. And the Israelite army is on one side of this valley, led by King Saul. On the other side of the valley is the Philistine army, and Goliath is kind of like leading it. He's scary. He's this real tall guy. He's 9 foot tall. He's beefy. He's strong, and he's kind of like just declaring. He's saying, "Hey, I'm going to fight whoever you bring out, and we'll do a hand-to-hand combat." And whoever wins for good. It's kind of like winner takes all. This guy, as I said, he's 9 foot tall. He has body armor, tunic, shin guards, helmet, weighing over 125 pounds. And then he has 3 separate weapons that are described. One is optimized for close combat. It's a thrusting javelin made entirely of bronze and was capable of penetrating a shield or even armor. And then he had a sword on his hip, but his primary weapon was this short-range spear with a metal shaft that was as thick as a weaver's beam. It had a cord around it, elaborate set of weights, so that it allowed to be released with extraordinary force and accuracy. And so here he is. He's covered with this armor, has these elaborate weights. He's this soldier waiting to take on whoever comes at him. David, his 3 oldest brothers, are in the army. So they're on the Israelite side. And David's dad, Jesse, says, why don't you go and bring some food to them to help out, because they had been there for over a month. It says 40 days. So David goes there just to help serve food. And he hears Goliath yelling out. Now, there's been this dialogue back and forth, trash talking between the Philistines and Israel. But now Goliath comes, and he's like bashing Israelites' God, talking about how worthless they are. Well, David hears this, and all the Israelites, they're just responding in fear. And he's thinking to himself, is nobody going to stand up for God? Is nobody going to stand up? And look at this guy. He just not only just trash talking, but talking about talking about our God. So there's that heart for God again that God saw in David. And so this comes out here. So the word gets out to King Saul that David's saying, hey, somebody should defend him, and I will be if that's how it needs to be. Saul calls him into his tent and says, and David says, hey, I'll take this guy. And Saul goes, listen, I don't think you're the one. You're just a shepherd boy. This guy's a trained soldier. And he goes, hey, listen, I've protected my dad's sheep from a bear, from a lion. I could take this guy. This is just another beast. No different than those other beasts. So finally, Saul agrees. He goes, okay, but at least wear my armor. So he puts on his armor, and David's trying to walk around in this stuff. He goes, this is your armor. This isn't going to work for me. I've got my own techniques, and I'll be able to do it. And he goes, God will deliver me. And so Saul says, okay, well, God be with you. And so Saul sends him on his way. Now, David, it turns out, is not just a good warrior. He is a projectile warrior. And now back in the ancient warfare times, there was 3 primary ways of fighting. One was on a horse or on a chariot. Another was to be like a heavy infantry. which is what Goliath was. You had those spears, you got that sword. And then the third one was to be a projectile warrior, somebody who shot arrows, somebody who slung stones. And they were incredibly accurate with slinging stones. And they would get up to 6 to 7 revolutions per second, and with deadly accuracy. And so Goliath does not see this coming. He's thinking that they're just going to bring out another heavy infantry just like he is, and he's going to duel and with sword to sword or with javelins. And David comes in with a different approach. It says, then he, talking about David, took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in a pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. So he's got these stones in his bag, and he's got his staff with him. And so Goliath sees this. He's come, this guy coming in with this staff or this stick, and he just thinks, oh, this guy's just going to try to bludgeon me with this stick. Beginning in verse 41, it says, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him, that's noteworthy. Notice that shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Now the Israelites had made an assumption about Goliath. Here he is, he's this mighty warrior, he's tall, he's powerful, and so they're seeing him as undefeatable. They're thinking, well, nobody can defeat this guy. That's why they recoiled in fear. But Goliath, here he says to David, he says, come to me. Now that's kind of an interesting comment. Here David's coming out, and here's this infantry who could normally would be able to run at another infantryman, but yet he says to David, he says, come to me. And then also he says this strange comment when he sees David's staff. He says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? David is only holding one stick, and he sees evidently 2. Many medical experts now believe that Goliath had a serious medical condition called acromegalia. It's a disease where a benign tumor is in the pituitary gland. And that what happens is it continues to release human growth hormones, and you end up with extraordinary size. The tallest person in medical history, Robert Wadlaw, suffered from acromegalia. At his death, he was 8 foot 11 inches and apparently still growing. One of the common side effects of acromegalia is vision problems. The pituitary tumors can grow to a point where they compress the nerves leading to the eye, severely restricting his sight or causing diplopia, which is double vision. And so that's why Goliath is led into the canyon floor with an attendant, because usually you would just carry your own shield. The only reason you would have a shield normally is if you're an archer, because both your hands are going, and so you have an archer's shield. Often there's an attendant with them. But soldiers, infantry, did carry their own soldiers. So here he has an attendant coming out. We're not sure how bad his vision is, but evidently maybe guiding him out. And he tells David, you come to me, because he probably can't see David very well. And when he does see him, he sees double. He says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Goliath saw 2. Now, from the ridge, the Israelites are looking, and all they see is this intimidating guy. But it's interesting, the very source of his strength was also the source of his weakness. Not being able to see, not being able to move. So David, probably unaware of all of this, but still, he's trusting God, and he comes at Goliath with boldness. And he doesn't just see a giant, he sees his God bigger than that giant. So he yells back in response. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Now David, he takes this stone, he whips it around, he hits him right between the eyes, the only place where really Goliath is exposed. He's got his body armor, his tunic, he's got his helmet, but there's a place in his forehead that's exposed, and David hits him right there, knocks him out, maybe kills him, but evidently just knocks him out. David walks over there and then takes his own sword and kills them. The Philistines see this. They see their giant has been killed, and they run and they flee. And what happens is this, all of a sudden now, David is somebody of, he's a national figure. And he becomes a great warrior because he's obviously walked into it with a lot of courage and great skill, but then his whole life he just becomes known as this great, great warrior and gets a lot of recognition because of it. You know, to this day, David and Goliath metaphors are real common because of here this seemingly impossible situation, and David was this instant hero, which leads to problems with Saul. Saul starts to chase him. That leads to the chase. After taking out Goliath, David becomes real successful, and his victories mount. Well, King Saul doesn't like this. He starts to get insanely jealous. There in 1 Samuel 18:9, it says, so from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. And he's so jealous, he wants to kill him. So he begins trying to kill him. First thing, when he's serving him, and because he's in his palace, and he throws javelins at him. But then David runs, and he starts chasing him for years, chasing him around, trying to kill him, looking for a way to kill David. And so a couple times, a number of years later on, a couple times, David actually has a chance to kill Saul. And he chooses not to. One of them happens in 1 Samuel 24. David and his men, they're hiding in a cave. And Saul goes in there by himself, leaves all of his protection because he's just going to go and relieve himself. You know, we don't really need to go there, right? So he's just going to relieve himself. But he's long enough there that, and he doesn't see because it's dark in the cave, and David and his men are in the back. So David sneaks up, and he cuts off a piece of his robe without Saul knowing. So I'm not sure how that happened. Maybe he took his robe off or something. But then Saul leaves. When he gets far enough away, David yells out and says, hey, I had a chance to kill you, but I chose not to. And look at your robe. That piece was cut off. That's how close I was with my knife. And Saul then says, okay, I'm not gonna chase you anymore. But that's a short-lived promise because he then continues chasing on. And then another time, second time, David and Abishai, they sneak into Saul's camp, and everybody's asleep. They're sound asleep. And so they have a chance to come into the camp and kill Saul, a second time to kill him. And Abishai says, I'll do it. Let me do it, David. And then, Saul will be out of the way. But David refuses. He goes, no. If Saul's going to die, it's going to be because God takes him out through some way. Whatever happens, it's not going to be because of me and my doing. And so here's what David says. He says, but David said to Abishai, he said, don't destroy him. He's talking about Saul. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. So it's very, very tempting and easy for him to take this opportunity to get all of this harassment out of him. We're, being threatened with his life. He's having to live in very, very difficult conditions. But David refuses to play God. He says, no, God will take care of this situation for me. There it is again, the heart for God. So we see over and over this heart inclined that I'm going to trust in God, even though the situation looks very, very difficult. And I have an opportunity to solve it in my own way. I'm not going to choose that way. I'm going to trust that the Lord will see this through. And so Saul, as I said, was remorseful both times, but breaks his promise both times when he says that he won't chase him. But David is right. Saul eventually dies in battle. And then David becomes the king, first of the tribe of Judah, and then 7 years later of all of Israel. And that brings us to AK, after becoming king. Now, the second half of David's story is found in 2 Samuel, and it's the story of his reign as king. And so if you zip over to chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, we're going to look at some key events that kind of summarize David's kingship. The first one is just his kingdom, the kingdom. That he starts to consolidate power. At that time, it was still pretty new. Saul was the first king. It was very, very fractured. So he's consolidating power. And at first, he's not king of all of Israel, just Judah. The rest of the tribes, they're following Saul's son, Ishbosheth. And so there's this 2-year civil war that's going on. And eventually, Ishbosheth is, because he loses power, David continually gains power. Eventually, Ishbosheth is assassinated. And then everybody says, hey, David, we're going to follow you. There's in verses 3 and 4, he says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king. So with the internal enemies vanquished, David now turns his attention outwardly to expand his kingdom. And he starts gaining these victories. The Philistines come in from the west. He starts to fight them and he's victorious. And then the Ammonites and the Moabites, they're on the east, and he's fighting them. And he's starting to expand his territory and solidify his kingdom. One of the things that he does right early on in his leadership is he wants a headquarters. And that's Jerusalem. So he needs to take Jerusalem. He does. He takes Jerusalem and has the Jebusites are there, and then renames it the city of David. He says after capturing the fortress, which is Jerusalem, he says David lived in it and named it David's city. He built the city around it. And so Jerusalem becomes the capital. He calls it the city of David. And then he takes the Ark of the Covenant and he brings that in to Jerusalem. So it's no longer just a political center. Now it's the religious center. And then David says, well, I want to build this great temple in Jerusalem for God where the Ark of the Covenant can reside. And so he says, I'm going to do that. And that leads to the promise. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 7. David tells Nathan, this prophet, about his excitement. Hey, I'm going to build a beautiful temple for God that the Ark of the Covenant can reside in. And Nathan goes, hey, that's awesome, man. Go do it. And so Nathan leaves, and that night God says, no, actually David's not the one to do it. His son will be the one to do it. But I've got a promise that I want you to deliver to David. So Nathan comes back to David and says, hey, you're not the guy to do the temple. You can gather materials for it, but God has a promise for you. And here's what he says. He says, God speaking, he says, I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you have gone. I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. So he kind of reminisces with David, says, hey, all these things that happened, God says, I did them. And David is aware of that. It wasn't in his strength. He wasn't able to do all these things. God had orchestrated the events. God was making all these things, opening doors and shutting other ones that no person could open. And David recognizes that. And part of the reason he says that is for the next thing that he's going to say. To build up his confidence. He says, when your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. The throne will be established forever. So David wasn't allowed to build the temple, but here he has this amazing promise where all of his descendants will be king and it will endure forever. Well, his son Solomon was king, but 40 years after David dies, after this promise, what happens is, if you know the story, is his grandson Rehoboam ends up making a mess of things, and the kingdom gets divided into Judah and into Israel. Then, after 400 years, the Assyrians come in, the Babylonians come in, and they exile a large portion of Israel and Judah, and there's no kingship at all. So you say, well, what happened? Was God wrong? Did he not see this? Here he had this promise to David. Where's the kingship that endures forever? Well, for the Jews, their understanding of this was that God was going to bring a Messiah to fulfill this promise. And of course, Christians, we actually believe Jesus is that Messiah. And that's what Mary was told when she found out she was going to give birth to the Son of God, to Jesus. Here's what she's told by the angel. It says, but the angel said to her, there in Luke 1, talking to Mary, he says, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. Now listen, he says, the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end. Jesus is the Son of David. He's the one who is the king that his reign will never end. And this is the promise. It's a shadow, a foreshadowing, saying this is what's going to happen. This is what he's talking about. So David, I mean, he had this amazing life, right? I mean, here he is, a nobody, catapulted to national limelight, and then just does everything right, it seems like. He's like the superhero. Did David do anything wrong? Well, he did. He did. And that's where we're going to just close with his failure. Because towards the end of his life, he made some mistakes. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 11. So you turn there, 2 Samuel chapter 11, and this is his failure. The failure. David was strolling one night along his palace that was high up overlooking the city of David, and he sees a woman bathing. And a very beautiful woman. And instead of looking away, he continues to look. And then continues to look. Finally, he decides, I have to have her. And so he abuses his power as king, has her brought over, and then they have an adulterous affair. And then she gets pregnant. Notice there in verse 4, he says, then David sent for her, this Bathsheba. And when she came, he slept with her. Then she returned home. When she found out that he had gotten her pregnant, she sent a message to inform him. So here, Bathsheba is this lady who he's had sex with. Now she's pregnant. So he comes up with a plan to cover it up, which is better than Watergate. Okay, this is David-gate. Okay, and here's his plan. He decides she's married to a guy named Uriah, who is a very, very trusted friend and soldier. And he's out in the field because they're currently in a campaign. So he decides to call Uriah back, and he's thinking to himself, hey, Uriah hasn't seen his wife in a long time. Surely they will have sex, when he comes back. And so David comes back, and he doesn't. He finds out that, he's sleeping right outside the palace. And so he calls Uriah up. He says, Uriah, what's up? I mean, I thought you'd go home, kind of like he doesn't want to give away too much. And Uriah says, and here's what Uriah's response. He's totally ambushed the fact that Uriah is so noble. He says, Uriah replied to David, he says, the ark and the armies and the general and his officers are camping out in the open fields. And should I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I will never be guilty of acting like that. So David doesn't see this coming. He's thinking, wow, this guy. So the next night he tries to get Uriah drunk, thinking that might work. That doesn't help. So that's plan B. So finally he goes to plan C. Plan C is simple. He decides to have Uriah killed. So he sends Uriah back with a note that he himself has to carry. And it says in there, that he's a plan for his own death. David writes in the note there to his general. He says, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. So that's his plan, and that's what his general does. And so he gets response back that, Uriah died. He was killed by the Ammonites. And so David has Bathsheba come over, and they end up, living together, and he's thinking, okay. And so David thinks he's gotten away with this. But what happens is God speaks to Nathan, and he comes to him, and he says, "Listen, God's got your number. God's got your number." And here's what he says. He says, "Why did you disobey me?" This is God speaking through Nathan. "Why did you disobey me and do such a horrible thing? You murdered Uriah the Hittite by having the Ammonites kill him, so you could take his wife. Because you wouldn't obey me and took Uriah's wife for yourself, your family will never have peace." And that's exactly what happened. So here God earlier, he says, "I forgive you, David. I forgive you for what you did. He goes, but there's going to be consequences for that behavior, for what you did. Sometimes we get messed up with that, right? I mean, we think, okay, if we're forgiven, then we're exempt from all the consequences of our behavior. But that's just not the way it is. So God forgives David, and that promise that he gave to him still is fulfilled. But yet he says, you're going to have problems for the rest of your life in your family. Some of the things that happened was a few years later, David's son Amnon, that's his son, ends up raping his half-sister, Tamar. Another son, Absalom, kills Amnon because for revenge for what he did to his sister. Later, Absalom leads a coup against his father. Finally, David's soldiers kill Absalom. And then another son, Adonijah, he tries to usurp the authority when King David's old. And this just on and on and on. His family has havoc going on that goes all the way back to this failure that he had. It wasn't just a failure. The difference between the rest of David's life and this failure was the rest of David's life, he was always trusting God. He was always having this heart, the heart of God, leading the way, not trying to take, like with Saul, I'm not going to kill Saul. I'm going to trust God when it comes to Goliath, and just over and over and over, even when things didn't make sense. But here, he takes it into his own hand. He has his own emotional needs, and he says, I need to solve these. I need to solve them this way, and goes outside of the way God had, his best plan for David's life. And that's what happens to us, right? When we get messed up, we start doing things or trying to fulfill our needs, our own ways, and then we end up in a mess. Here's some things that I think we can learn, several lessons from David's stories. Number one is just seeking God, saying, God, I want to have a heart after you. And, that's something that really only you'll really know. And so you just have to be willing to ask yourself, how's my heart? Do I have a heart that seeks after God, or am I trying to fulfill my needs my own ways? And then trusting God in impossible situations. I mean, we looked at Goliath, but there's really a number of situations where David is in a completely impossible situation, it looks like. And yet he trusts God through it, even when it doesn't make sense. And then trusting God to fulfill his promises through our lives. You see, David's story, could you imagine if David never interacted with God's story? Because, we're talking about stories, and there's all these stories, and when when there's a God encounter, everything changed for David. Without God, he would have just been a little shepherd boy, right? Just a nobody. I think about my own story. My story, I was going nowhere fast. And when God came into my life, it changed everything. Now, I didn't know I was going to be a pastor. I mean, for a number of years, I was just seeking, maybe God was going to lead me into business or various things. But it's not just pastors that God uses. I mean, God uses us when we say, God, I'm willing to be used by you. I want to be salt and light in this world. I want to be part of your redemptive plan and your story that you're unfolding in this world. And that's what it means to have a heart after God. Okay? Let's bow our heads and pray. Now I'm going to invite Clarence and Taryn to come out. They're going to sing a song in just a moment. But, Father, I just pray, Lord, that I just know you use unlikely people. And this room is filled with a bunch of unlikely people. We've made a lot of mistakes. And yet, God, this story of David is about somebody who just, even though he made failures, even though he messed up, he continually trusted in you. And so, Lord, I just pray that we would be like this. Some of you are facing giants, impossible situations, and you're being tempted to either look at the problem from the world's perspective or look at it saying, no problem is too big for God. So, Lord, we just invite you right now, Lord, just rebuild our trust in you. Rebuild those places where we're broken. You use broken vessels. Now, I'm a testament at that. I know many of you can say, yeah, that's true for me. Let God rebuild a vision in you, in your heart. It's not too late. I challenge you tonight just to say, God, today I want to be somebody who takes a one step closer to being somebody who you can use